Hi, everybody. Hopefully, everyone is still, no matter what the expression is on the news, is still distancing themselves from others around 6 feet and washing hands and being careful. Uh, Once again, this is far from being over and probably will go on for quite a bit of time just yet. Anyway, all kinds of ideas will come forward for all kinds of reasons. Try to be a little realistic the best you can. We have a few questions here, but before I get into that, I'd like to remind everybody that of a basic principle that helps some of these questions and answers make sense. One of the basic things that makes sense energetically from my perspective is that we, from the beginning of our lives, have had energy move into us for the purpose of developing actions and reactions, ways of engaging with the world that are not really basically um, any different than how normally others engage with the world, but recognizing that these energies are not perceived on the level of energy flow through the chakras or the valves that surround us and are a part of us, and then eventually link together and move into different levels of our existence, yet unknown to us. It ends up being really interesting if you're asking questions about personality orientations and purposes and reasons for different kinds of personalities. When you start looking at renderings of how one lives life right from the beginning, you start to understand that individuals utilize at least how they think life should be used by copying other people, as we've talked about many times, and by being creative themselves and constructing personalities. And thus, these personalities, at the same time as being constructed, are in a way kind of protected by the individual unknowingly or reflexively because they're making an impact on the individual. Thus, the individual is creating sensory and mental and emotional images within them that they're not really aware of. Yet at the same time, they have their heroes, heroines. They have their ways of thinking what would be the right way to live, not the right way to live, for the definition of the images that they are seemingly involved with. For example, poets and some of my old friends, painters and writers, thought back in the 60s and the 50s that they had to be destitute to be good creators of stuff, poems, good painters. They had to be looking for some image that they projected. They would buy weird hats. They would wear vests that are really, for them, images of painters or poets. They would drink a lot. They would fight a lot. They would rage a lot. They would engage a lot. This, whether known or unknown, and sometimes they were well known, were images that were created by the use of energy or intensity internally, so that there was a show or projection of a form that others could see and know then that they are somehow affiliated with others who have been kind of like them, living in bad, uncomfortable places, various ways of looking at certain images. Okay, that's an image. It's okay. It's allowed. It is a possible rendering of a poet or a writer. It doesn't mean that you're a good writer or a good poet or have a great ability to paint if you live like that. In the older traditional Renaissance folks, this was not a really good way to do things. Some folks that were a little later than the Renaissance, 1800s, 17, even 19, but more 1800s, you weren't trying to be broke. You were broke because you couldn't sell your paintings. So you had to live where you could. You had to engage how you could. And that was basic survival. Somehow we get all mixed up with this stuff. And there are renderings of how one should be under basic circumstances. By the way, this goes for spiritual beings. This goes for highly employed vice presidents and presidents and managers and you name it, it has a face, a definition, an image. Male or female makes no difference. It's categorized by the individual's will, reflexive response, some redundancies, as I'm trying to imply somewhat, and also just trying to engage in a manner that fits somehow with an already constructed personal view of how one should be if one is this or that or the other thing. It is quite an interesting thing what we do as human beings if you can buy in a little bit to the idea of the individual unconsciously using energy for the purpose of creating a form that she or he are not even aware of. But this formula is consistent. It's consistent all across all cultures. If you're in India and you become a person who is a Swami, there's a certain way to dress. I once was in Calcutta and met a young Englishman who had been in India for 6 months to a year, and he had his hair up in a top knot, and he was dressed in garb that might have been okay in the 18th, 17th centuries, but kind of different now. And now was back in the 90s, about 1992. And he had pictures drawn on his forehead, which implied that he was a yogi. And he was going to mail a letter back to Germany. And I asked him about some of this stuff, and he said, it gets me in the mood or a mode where I can feel as if I'm partaking in something that is valuable because I'm attempting to be spiritual. I said, oh. And he was legitimate. He was not having me on, so to speak. These things are not negative, not positive, but if they have an impact on an individual, usually the individual is not as conscious of the impact, just does it because it does have an impact. There's an inner sensing that is clearly valued by the individual unknowingly. In this case, he had a recognition that he was not really living in the 16th century or the 17th century. He was living now, but some of his cohorts were dressing like this and they were aligning with each other. I felt that way when I was in management. I had a great looking suit, nice tie, and my hair cut, and all the rest of it. And I thought to myself, what is this about? Oh, managers look like this. They walk like this. They do this kind of thing. It allows other managers to see that you value the manager's image. It allows other people to see that you value an image that relates to spiritual growth. Whether he was more spiritually oriented than anybody else who was involved with being around him is up for grabs. Chances are it may be, may not be, maybe something that he'll remember all his life and be proud of and recognize that he at least attempted to live a life that related to his version of what spirituality had to be, or what managers have to be like, or what painters have to be like. But the point of reference here is that this energy that is coming into you is used for purposes related to those things that you have in your mind or in your belief or registered somewhere in a way that allows you to be comforted by you. This comforting can be negative, it can be positive, it can be neutral, it can be 1,000 different kinds of things. But one thing it isn't, it's often not recognized by the individual doing it. And this is really important because of how we see others, how they see us. We nurture a view, I don't care what it is, about how another constructs themselves. Some may not be healthy, but that is the version that they believe is viable for them, and they don't realize it's not as healthy as others can be. If they begin to realize it, they may try to change it and find it very difficult to do so. There is no negation in that. It's just that an individual has acted like this from the time that they believed they needed to help them to survive or engage with the world in a way that made them feel comforted by themselves. And ultimately, that energy they're using, if you can make sense of this, is an act of love by another level of energy that comes into us for the purpose of helping us to learn how to live on these planes. Now, that's a mouthful and a mindful. Our belief systems would not always agree with that statement because we tend to stop tersely before we can allow ourselves to handle an action that another has that seems out of sorts with what we believe. That's called actually criticism, judgment. And in those moments, we are creating and constructing, with energy coming into us, a formula that relates to being a good critic. We need to possibly, at least philosophically, at least an attempt to soften down that inner or external critic, because the critic itself is taking over. It is not you, the person who's creating the critic. It's the critic that has taken over, this form that you've constructed is now running you. It is most interesting to realize the possibility that your beliefs overturn and keep you from seeing them, or seeing that they may be falling short of a broader way of engaging with life. This is not so simple. If it was, we'd all be enlightened long ago. And enlightenment really means the ability to handle tremendous amounts of energy for the purpose of being helpful to others. Not perform elegances in the eyes of others so you're proving your superiority, because that is just an act of personal use. It has nothing to do with spirituality. That allows a thought to creep into your mind, and a consideration to perhaps be acknowledged, maybe not, depending on how you see things, that some of those performances are to remind you that you're okay. Nothing to do with internal growth, much to do with capacity. And this, since the Renaissance, has been a profoundly important thing in our worlds, culturally speaking. And our performance level relative to the culture is influencing a way of seeing deeper levels of growth spiritually. And of course, how a person should be, I use the should word, or could be, might be a little bit more helpful, but only in relationship to the cultural ideal or the individual ideal. And by the way, if it makes sense to you, we could begin to recognize that our views of spiritual development and growth are lacking. We are seeing them from a point of view that relates to how a human person relating now in the world, not in the future, now in the world, should be like if they were spiritual, if they were a good painter, if they were truly a poet, if they were truly a president or CEO, whatever it is. Not real. Much could be talked about in these things, and much can be thought about. I think these things are worth thinking about because of the definition of being lit up by, let's say, another level or higher level of consciousness, meaning more energy comes into you that is filled with conscious awareness. The images that are already there, or the one you have, I have, anyone has, now sees you from a different perspective based on noticing more, being more aware, because energy that has more awareness in it has entered in for us to continue our development, which means it may be that we find out that the extending of our personalities' senses, 5 senses, 6 senses, don't care, still in the early days will focus on how a person is constructed, what they should be like. And the critic comes in and says, no, if they're not like this, then they're not really spiritual. and no view of allowing a person to be spiritual beyond where we can recognize our already defined spiritual way that must be real versus any others. This energetic proposal is valuable if you can perceive that energy flowing in through those chakras, perceive you using it for the purpose of you being you, whatever that would be, and that is legitimate because we do that from the time of our birth, one could say. If you're going to think of these chakras still being there when we're in our mother's womb, then we must start even then, perhaps as we develop towards the verge of moving into these external planes, more energy can begin to engage in a different way so we can learn how to live here. Copy our parents, copy our heroes, everyone who, our teachers, whatever it may be, and construct a form that we feel comforted with. The zone of comforting is vital, in my opinion. It's only an opinion. It's how I see it, but you need to think about these, perhaps, these things wish, or at least present thought beyond what has already been resolved in a mind and in a perception as well. I don't care whether you can perceive auras. I don't care whether you can engage with all kinds of flowing energies. And yeah, they're perceivable. My God, that can't be the end point. But they're not negative. They're just a focus on the personalized versions of what might be viable in anyone's developmental process, possibly. The reason why I'm talking about these ideas related to energy coming in and you constructing a form energetic around you, as well as in this structure, physical, emotional, and mental ways of engaging with the world, is that because that's what we do. I mean, that's how you engage with the world and create a tool, a personality, so that you can do so. This is not only talking about a you that I'm presenting. I can only see myself in this particular version of website engagement, but every one of us on the whole of all of these planes, every culture has the same relationship with the one that you're trying to make sense of, that I'm trying to make sense of, that others have tried to make sense of. Others have experienced slightly different things beyond their personalities' orientations and found them difficult to deal with because they didn't follow the definitions, the ruminations of others. They followed the ruminations or the engagements that they had personally, internally, related to themselves. Natural thing. That's why reading is so important. Read a whole bunch of stuff. It doesn't mean you're great for reading the stuff. It means you're broadening your mind so that if experiences occur that might be not the same, but similar in some way, you get the idea that you may be okay within you. You might be learning something. Our tendency is to stop too soon. Once you gain access to something that's different than anybody else, then that becomes important. This is normal in the normal world. Once you are recognized as a very, very good writer, then you have to be a writer. A very good painter, you have to paint. A very good person that is different than others, then you have to be different than others. You are not different than others. You are you, an individual in a very large group called humanity, which has no exclusions relative to that group. All those who are functional, meaning breathing, and those who have had breath in them and no longer have, all who come into the world will be engaging in the same way as you did. You will learn that you are more superior to Abel next door or Alice down the street. And you're not. You're just different. This is very difficult for us to understand because we are not consciously aware of those energies coming into us yet. Perhaps in the future, our next step is to become more conscious, but that promotes more difficulty, meaning you will see things in terms of how you function as not what you thought you were like. Somehow you will be less than or more than. Both of those things are difficult to deal with. But approach from a learning perspective and a sense of vitality. One that moves through zones of feeling uncomfortable and more comfortable, recognizing things and being in wonder somewhat of what you do perceive, but not, and other times not necessarily in wonder at all, slowly affecting your relationship with who you are and why you are that you are. You realize you are just you and you are okay. Learning how to move beyond the you constructed is okay as well, rather than only protecting the you've constructed and keeping you from moving forward continually beyond that which you have been in any given second. This is just, one could say, rhetorical in a kind of a way, or rhetoric in another way. But if you are sincerely engaging, as others who become more conscious are, you notice one very simple, tiny little detail. My God, if I'm like this, so are others capable of being. How can I help? That, oh, by the way, that's a service thing. Whatever little help you can give is vital. I'd like to try to answer Christina Chelminska. I'm so sorry, Christina. I know you're going to give it to me when I finish this. She says, I wonder if you might answer my following question. How do you know that you love yourself or others? How do you know if you love yourself or others? In lieu of the information that I've been discussing or attempting to express, you begin somewhere along the line to realize that you love the image that you project because it gives you comfort. all kinds of dialogue, all kinds of ways of thinking. You are justified for thinking, reacting, and being the way you are always occur. It's an act of love based on the energy coming into you. It will help you to see you ultimately as you are, but slowly, so that you may not be as comfortable, but you take comfort in the fact that you can affect that little bit by little bit by little bit, and you can start laughing at what you're seeing instead of grumbling at what you're afraid to see. All of these things are normal for us. I'm talking to Christina now because she has a sense of humor. There are many, I would say, that might not be laughing at what I'm saying right now because their sense of humor, and you must realize that spirituality is really dead serious. So is living life. Has to be serious. I'm inclined to agree somewhere around there. Some of that may be halved. I know as a child walking into a church, you had to dumb down the intensity inside yourself that was filled with life, or your parents might exorcise, in the old traditional way, your way of acting because you're exuberant in such an august place. Perhaps not. But nonetheless, we then are trained to use our intensity to hold back our relationship with just being young. We're trained the same way every day of our lives. That's enculturation. It's not negative. It's part of how we engage with each other and allow each other to attempt to be okay with each other. In spite of the dialogue that goes on in your head about what should be and what shouldn't be in relationship to being this or that, which, by the way, happens for some, about 90% of the population, perhaps. Maybe the number is low. But nonetheless, it's okay. But it's even better if you notice and not necessarily agree. There's an act of love that's involved with being the way you have trained yourself. Unknown to you, you do what you do for the purpose of feeling somehow nurtured by the act, the expression, the thinking. It's highly charged emotionally with an act of love that relates to those images that you took from, copied. You believe the culture should be this way versus that way. People should be like this under these circumstances versus just people trying to make sense of things and finding out they can't. They have a terrible reaction. No, not terrible. A natural reaction that allows them to feel more comforted under dire circumstances or circumstances that appear dire to them. They may not be dire at all, but they might be. Understanding how others react and a kind of similarity that can occur within you under certain circumstances allows you to recognize in another the depth of fear, the depth of nervousness, the depth of wanting to be that which perhaps cannot be reached in their lifetime, some ideal that is prominent in a stylized engagement with how one must be. Yet it causes them great difficulty because they feel they cannot attain it, or when they do think they are attaining it, they become involved with a vitality that is kind of elevated, yet not recognized by them. Looking at it from a personal point of view, one could say, my God, this can happen to me too, but how come I can't see it all the time? If you saw it all the time, you would not agree with you. You would begin to change images within you that you find really not comforting in other people and how they function. This is very difficult for us because we're not a philosophical, psychological grouping of humanity, yet that can allow ourselves to be curious about what would happen if we shifted or changed something. Yet we have done this shifting and changing from the time of our birth. You no longer act like you were two. Well, is it possible you may? When you don't get your way in the mind of a 2-year-old, do you react? Do you think that you are exactly right? More right than anyone else can be? This would be normal for a 2-year-old, maybe 3. Terrible tubes, whatever. You got to live up to that. No, you don't. You're not 2 anymore. But we don't know that we are nervous enough to self-protect. We just do it automatically. Almost automatonish. To the degree that ultimately, with new energy coming in, slightly used differently, slightly with more love in it, differently, we can perceive without negation, my God, I've constructed this form for a purpose of survival relative to the world I believe is there. And in some circumstances, the world is reminiscent of that. Truly. In others, not so much. However, if we use certain reflexes all the time, it's like a cobweb that wraps around the prey of the moment for the purpose of helping ourselves be okay with us. That's an act of love. Strange as it may sound, it's still an act of love. If more perception is there to see that action, it's also there so that you don't negate you for being the way you don't like in others. But you need to have respect for yourself and be okay with learning. I don't know anyone that hasn't remembered a tiny bit of learning in their life. Oh my God, I didn't know. Oh my God, I would have liked to have known that, so I wouldn't have done this or that or some other thing. I could have done this, may not have worked out, but I could have done something different had I known something slightly different than what I knew. Each and every one of us acts in a moment relative to what they believe they know. Think about that one for a minute. I do often. It's often annoying. Why can't I? How come I couldn't bring this to mind to do that? Why was it not there? Even if it was, would I have done what my system was trained to do to make me feel okay with me? We would like to think that we would do something slightly different, but we may not, because our intense images of how, even if we don't know what they are still highly sophisticated. We are a tremendous conglomerate of levels of consciousness. Oh, by the way, if we say we are, that must include others who also don't know, who believe they do, who would like to do something different, but this big reflex does something that it's trained to do because it's used to doing it, and it makes this image comforting within a construct that relates to time zones from early going right up to a present. This is uncomfortable for us, and I know this to be true. However, this is me expressing. Perhaps thinking about things like this may be helpful in the you that might be considering and reconsidering. Christina has a good, solid mind. She's able to think about these things, therefore ask questions that are very difficult to answer in a very logical way. In my world, this is a logical engagement. Adversity affects you from the beginning. So, when I was born, I came out of my mother's womb. I wasn't handed a lollipop. I couldn't breathe. But some doctor shoved something up my nose and gave me a whack in the back. And I was able to breathe, all kinds of gut coming out of my lungs. And I said, what the heck is this all about? No, I couldn't say that, but my reaction said it. I was comfortable, minding my own business. Nobody to tell me what was right or wrong. Nobody to influence me, except the tones and sounds all around me, living in the wilderness and under the circumstances that I was living on. Oh, that was nice. You could hear little birds in the background. Now I got to deal with this. Does adversity affect you? Lee Martin asks. What do you think? Under these circumstances, these wonderful, engaging circumstances of life, energy flowing into you that you can use freely for the purpose of engaging with you and others and attempting to try to understand beyond your current understanding. Wow. And it's given freely. Oh, just a minute now. There is pressure to remain exactly the same as you have been by others. Very interesting thing. I remember leaving home in and around when I was about 17, 18 years old, and being away for quite a while, engaged with other people, and went back to visit the family home. When I walked through that door, tremendous pressure was put on me to be exactly the same as when I left, and I wasn't. But I could remember how I was when I laughed, at least my version. And so I was tempted to be and do exactly how I was the moment I left. Fortunately, it was under decent circumstances. Think of this in terms of you engaging with another person. Without thinking, you didn't notice. But you have to be exactly how you think you need to be when you engage with that person so that they recognize your relationship with you the way you want them to. So you set yourself up and your images comply because you're practiced in it. I am sad to say, many of us, most often, don't have any idea that that's how we believe we should be. It's not our fault. Becoming more consciously aware of that can be uncomfortable. Yet, if you look at it again from a learning perspective, is it really okay for you to be okay with a you that you consider slowly broadening beyond how you were yesterday? It's a thought provoking concept. I believe recognizing that you are allowed to love you as you are and slightly different and more different, even perceiving to the depths of that love coming into you, that flow of energy, and recognizing the fact that it is helping you to remain the same until you don't really want to, or you see that this is not what you want to move towards. That promise of awareness related to the soul, one could say, those chakra systems, valves, that as they link together become more in a relationship to be involved with a broadening within the personal, but also a recognizing by the personal of that inner flow, which relates to love, which takes away the emphasis that we apply to the personalized versions of who we are and how important we are. There is a greater level of importance than our personalized versions of us. And that is being able to be a link between a higher state than the ones that we already know and these states that we already are engaged with. I wish you all well in this journey. All folks who are attempting this journey, be they related to your belief or some other, are relating to the journey. Our criticism holds us so that we can't move beyond what we can allow ourselves to perceive and understand until we can open a slight bit more to the realization that that flow is there helping us to be more able, not to be more superior. Yet, because superiority and inferiority is a judgment based on our belief principles, we have to grow through these as well. Yet, we may not. Each of us has some, but it's up to us to be okay with seeing them and reconsidering. If we can do this, I have no doubt that it would be helpful. But it is a journey and sometimes disconcerting and sometimes awe-filled and sometimes just interesting to see and recognize. We are on that journey. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Meditation.
We're now going to meditate, and I wish you well in the meditation. And now we'll just begin to do the balancing and the grounding. Good night, everybody.